Well, that's what. So, in terms of what do I do, is that I'm really interested in the intersection between informal civic participation and formal decision making, and the fact, and I became interested in that because we know that informal civic participation is growing hugely, but we have a massive democratic deficit. So the question to me is, what actually can those two things come together better? And through that question, I've ended up very interested in digital civic space and the way in which networks of networks manifest in those spaces.
And when you're meeting someone who has no idea about the field, how do you describe what it is that you do?
The simplest way, and the way which I find most effective with people who have no idea and possibly quite a lot of fear about the digital bit of that, is to say that we spend an awful lot of time thinking about our public realm. You know, we think about the high street, we think about the village green, we think about the market square, but we spend no time thinking about their digital equivalents. And that given that we all have a digital wrapper growing around our lives, the question I'm interested in is how do we make sure that civil society has got a place in that wrapper, and that if you do walk down a street and see a digital overlay, you're seeing the community and the people that live there, and not just having opportunities to buy stuff.
And so I guess another way of accessing, or another version of that question is, what is it that you want to change about the system in which you work?
So in terms of what I want to change about the system that I work in, and I would broadly define that as the relationship between the citizen and the state, is that I want a stronger voice for citizens in a way which is that you are able to use these kind of tools, digital tools, to express yourselves, and that government is systemically able to listen. And I want to shift the way our democracy works towards more direct representation. I think we want representation and we want a representative democracy, but I think that people have a right to and expect to have a direct relationship with the people who are representing them. So in terms of my whole system shift, that is changes in behaviours in civil society, in our democratic representatives, but also in the organisations and the individuals that support that relationship. So for me, changes in local government, but changes at national and international level as well. So I like to say it's quite ambitious, but systems change is ambitious, and you can't think about systems change without thinking about how are you going to affect all of the stakeholders within that. Now, there is a different theory of change which is more revolutionary than that, but my personal belief is that we want to think about this in ways of what are we taking forward with us, and that's why you need to be having parallel conversations with everyone you're trying to affect.
And that's perfect, because my next question was going to be about theory of change. So do you have a theory of change, and if you do, can you describe it?
So my theory of change is really it is a design-based one, which is that what you're trying to do. So it works better if I talk it through as an example. So I work with local government. Local government holds a lot of the process and the structure and the discipline of how we run our communities, and that needs preserving and that needs managing. However, we know that local government and all forms of government, it will have to be radically different. So even if you don't subscribe to the whole world is changing, it's a network society, is that austerity and the changing nature, other global changes and influences are going to mean that we're going to end up probably with smaller state, perhaps with more influence, but physically and headcount smaller. So the change that I work on is how do you maintain that at the same time as starting a conversation which is a vision of the future, and how do you start designing that vision of the future in a way where you hold the vision lightly, firmly enough that it is describable, but lightly enough that you can include people in the shaping of it. And so it is an evolutionary theory of change, which is that if you conclude, as I do, that the future relationship between citizen and state has to be more co-productive, the power has to have shifted, is that you cannot have a theory of change, which is a revolutionary one of people trying to push one particular idea. This has to be hold it lightly, build a space and the qualities of that space around it, and then respond to what people do in the space that you've built. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does, and it also preempts the next one, which was going to be about visions of the future, which is, like, how important do you think it is to articulate visions of the future?
I think it's tremendously important that you articulate a vision of the future if you're trying to have an effect. It is that if you don't want to be a passive commentator on things, then you need to articulate a vision of the future, and you need to start exploring that with other people. It doesn't mean that future is the one that's going to come true, but I personally believe that we're in an epoch shift. You know, we are moving from a post-industrial society into something else. I think at the moment that it's probably a network society, and there's all kinds of qualities that we can talk about with that. But during that change period, you know, sort of social norms and behaviours and structures and culture is all in flux. Everything is in flux. And the only way that you can hope to shape that, I think, is that you start to articulate a potential vision of the future, and that you encourage people to move there with you. Because at the moment, nobody knows what the next, nobody ever knows what the next 100 years are going to look like. But actually, the accelerant effects of globalism and technology mean that need to articulate a firm vision, I think, is even greater than it has been in the past.
And before you talked about, you know, articulating a vision, but doing it in a light enough way that it's inclusive. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a bit more about how you do that?
Yeah, so in terms of how do you articulate a vision which is both lightly held enough that people can feel that they can join it and that they can be part of it, because all of the vision I would talk about would be co-produced, at the same time as giving it enough definition that people can say that's something that I want to do. And my experience of doing this is that you have to lead with values, and you have to lead with descriptive qualities rather than structure or even objectives. And so an example of this would be working with a local authority I'm doing a lot of work with at the moment, where, you know, so we built it we talked to people internally, we looked at what the community were doing independent of the council, and the very light vision there is that they have a real aspiration to be the best kind of 21st century public service organisation that's possible, but one which is completely native to the network society, which is social behaviours and social technologies. And so this idea that, okay, on one hand they've got public service values and social values, and they've got social behaviours, social technologies, that's a light vision of the future that people can understand enough to be able to start to move towards, but it's not drawn out in so much detail that they're sitting there going, oh, well, you've already decided our future and we don't like it.
And it links into the next question, which is about strategies and tactics. So we've talked a bit about theory of change, we've talked about the importance of vision. Can you talk more about the specific strategies and tactics that you use in your work?
Yeah, so in terms of what strategies and tactics I use in order to build these kind of projects and to work with people is that, as I come at this from a research point of view, is that I firmly believe we really don't know what's going to happen, and I also firmly believe that if you really think that things should be co-designed and co-produced, is if you go into this with too strong an agenda of your own, then firstly you're destined to fail, but also you're never going to have the effect that you want. You're never really going to leave something behind which is owned by the people that you're working with. So I tend to structure projects around an action research methodology. So action research, identify a problem, identify a possible solution, work with stakeholders to actually try that solution, and then sit back and reflect and refine and change it. And that seems very simple, and it chimes with things like lean theory and, you know, sort of agile, all kinds of things. But if you have a purity of discipline about doing that, particularly about the reflection thing, I find you've got a couple of different effects. Is firstly, the working iteratively, and by sharing this stuff openly, you do, through those iterations, bring more people into it. But also, you are moving into a state of co-production. You're not, you know, you're genuinely learning and sharing as you're learning, rather than you have got a plan and you're piloting it and then you're going to roll it out irrespective of the results. So it seems really simple, but actually forcing people to take the time to reflect and genuinely making that reflection objective, I think, is really critical here.
And you work with organisations and people who hold very different kinds of power.
Yes.
Can you talk a bit more, I guess, about how you strategize around the different stakeholders that you use and the way that you use power within that?
So the way in which I use power within the work is firstly that taking that leap into the future is to talk about network and not hierarchical power. So it's not that we ignore hierarchical power, but what we try and do is we try and boot camp hierarchical leaders through an understanding of network power. So we've got a couple of parallel programs. We're doing something called Network Counsellor, which is helping elected representatives to understand how to be network counsellors and how to use those different forms of power, or in many cases with them, how to acknowledge that that's actually what they're doing. And we have something equivalent that we work through with senior leadership teams. What we're increasingly doing would be offering that kind of analysis to the community as well. So in terms of how we use power, the first thing we do is we change the terms of the conversation and we say, look, this is about network power. In a digital space, network power is all about relevance. So your contribution is your power in this space. And just by illustrating that, which is very easy to do in a digital environment, even if that digital environment is actually a way of mirroring what's happening offline, is that suddenly you've changed everything. The other way in which you've changed everything is by insisting on a huge degree of openness and actually asking people to operate within those terms. So not allowing the discrete spaces of power that are there previously, but actually putting everything out into this new arena. Now, that's the kind of that's the direction of travel. That's the strategy that we're adopting. Around that strategy is an awful lot of negotiation and an awful lot of helping individuals find their place in that new world, and an awful lot of time which is and compromising sometimes. So sometimes you do have to sit down with a suit with the senior leadership team to make them feel okay about it. But as long as you don't compromise on that objective, which is we are moving towards network power, we are moving towards this being open, we are moving towards this being a more co-productive relationship. As long as all of those side trips are side trips on that bigger journey, then that's fine.
And you already described your work in a way that involves lots of different stakeholders.
Yeah.
When you're doing projects that involve lots of different organisations, how do you make that collaboration work? And so what are some of the lessons you've learned from that, but also what are some of the common barriers that you come up against?
So in terms of common lessons and common barriers around multi-organisation working, and also accepting that you're actually often trying to hold the space for the community to be in that conversation. So rather than the community being mediated by no, we speak for you, no, we speak for you, actually having people directly in there. There's a degree of art and science in that. Firstly, it's about I will tend to insert myself into that network in order to hold the space to some extent. So I will be there and mediating some of the relationships between senior people. I will be managing some of the information flow and making sure that keeps moving. And the trick, if you make it work by being there, is understanding how to extract yourself as well. The other thing is to have a very, very a very clear strategy, which is about how do you bounce buy-in from person to person to person. So you will tend to find someone who is a champion, and then it's finding out who is influenced by that person, and then they're your next port of call. So being very, very tactical and slightly Machiavellian about how do you change that network dynamic within that group, so that actually you've leveled the playing field in the way that I described before, but you've not made yourself central to actually making it work. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And it would be useful to hear a bit more if there are any kind of common obstacles that you come across again and again when you're
Okay, so yeah, in terms of common obstacles around this kind of work, first obstacle is the senior person who doesn't understand their own relevance and is relying too much on their own job title rather than actually on what they are able to contribute directly. Another really common barrier is people who believe that they're connectors but are actually gatekeepers, and we see that a lot. So people who don't understand the reciprocity that really is required to make network dynamics really work. So we see that a lot. We see the word partnership is kind of like moving into the word collaboration without actually changing meaning. And this means, how do we interface our organisational boundaries rather than how do we blur and remove our organisational boundaries? And there is an awful lot. There's an awful lot of that. And underlying that, I think the biggest barrier is that most of the time I'm working with the public sector is going to get smaller, and nobody is really preparing the workforce for the fact that they are going to be fewer of them. And I think there's a point in here, which is, how do you have an honest conversation with the workforce, which is, yeah, we are talking about stuff which is going to make the organisation smaller. We can't avoid that, but what we can do is we can be skilling you for the future. So investing in the workforce now to both to be a responsible employer, but also to unlock the workforce's willingness to engage and work in different kind of ways, because we have a lot of people who, we have been hired under a completely different set of priorities. So one of the other blockers that we come across around working this way is more of a hidden one, which is that we've got workforces who actually know that changing their work practices is going to result in a smaller workforce, and we're not at the moment equipping them. We're not necessarily being honest with them about that conversation, and we're not equipping them with the skills that they're going to need in the future, because the only way you can expect someone to be positive about that kind of change is if they see an alternative future for themselves. And at the moment, I'm not sure we're doing enough with that. There's another issue in there, which is that when you sit down and have that conversation with people, you really quickly realise that nobody's been changing their hiring practices around the fact that actually you need people who are collaborators, connectors, sharers, content creators, people who've got very different attributes to how we have previously recruited into a lot of the public services. And so that's the less glamorous end of this, which if you don't get it right, you're not going to achieve systemic change.
Theory and practice. You are in the midst of that at the moment. I am curious as to how you integrate theory into your practice. So
the integration of theory and practice is something which I feel really strongly about. I don't know if I always achieve it, but I've got a number of strategies which I use. The first thing is that I blog very vociferously about my research. So I will tend to capture my theoretical thinking and reflect it for people, so that I make it open and accessible. I then that sort of frees up my theoretical brain to go off and be more practical when I'm actually talking to people. The fact is, there is a limit to how unabstract I can make the way in which I approach these things, and so I rely on working with colleagues who see exactly the same thing that I see, but are able to articulate it in a completely different kind of way. There's a separate point, so that's the practical way in which we're coping about it. There's a separate thing here, which is a kind of like, which is a point as me as a baby academic. Hopefully, by the time someone's watching this, having completed my FIVA successfully for my PhD, which is that I think that the universities need to get out of their caves and actually get into some public spaces. Is that theory is of little use if we can't show the practical application for it, and practice benefits massively from the rigour of theory and of the data collection process which an academic process brings to bear. And so if we're talking about collaboration and participation, I want academics out in the world who are actually participating in demonstrating theory as well as sitting in ivory towers, sort of concocting it. That may be a little bit more difficult to achieve, but that's certainly what I aim to do.
And how does that work on a kind of practical basis with a project? How will your understanding of theory shape the way that your organisation approaches and carries out a piece of work?
Yeah. So in terms of how my sort of theoretical research affects what we do as a business and what we do therefore do with clients, there's two different manifestations of that. One is, and because we're a digital company, is the tools that we build are built entirely on, not entirely, but the strand that I'm talking about, which is called Citizenscape, is basically built on my PhD research. And so there's a strong articulation of why we're designing digital civic space in that particular way, which currently goes to the tune of 90,000 words. And I work with my design team around understanding what that means and interestingly, sharing research interviews that I use to build into theory, they're using to build into user stories. So working from the same raw research base, and then actually the end point of my research will be, because I'm an action researcher, will be, this is the thing that we're going to try. And it's taking people with me on that journey. So that's the clearest manifestation. Is actually we build the stuff to try it out. And I'm very, very lucky to work with colleagues who are prepared to do that. The other way in which it manifests is so around community engagement theory and stuff like that. So I'm part of you. There's no point in building stuff if you're not thought about how you're going to work with people, how you're going to work with democracy. Is that I will tend to find a point of entry with the practitioners that I'm working with, where I am able to connect my theoretical base to something which they feel comfortable with. So the advantage of being a multidisciplinary researcher is that you can do that with quite a lot of people. So if I'm talking to community engagement practitioners, I will tend to have a theory-based conversation which is led with a conversation about asset-based community development. So I am able to reference a lot of other community development theory from that, but I can articulate it and I can connect with them on that. So it's not so much theory shopping, but it's being selective and saying the point is about points of entry. So I hope that my stuff generally holds together across that multidisciplinary space, but in terms of actually taking it out to work with people, I find the piece of theory which actually they can respond to. And then firstly, that builds a bridge between what they know and what I know, and it then gives them that reassurance that they can connect into the rest of what I'm doing. I also sort of finally is that I work quite hard to try and find the narrative in the theory. So what is the story if you're talking about asset-based community development? What's the story in co-production? What's the story around network of networks, which is a very in my head a very clear articulation of a different view of imagining what a community looks like. What's the story there, which you can talk to a 70-year-old counsellor and saying, this is what I'm trying to do with you. And I do think if you know the theory, you should be able to tell the story. So I would say I'm imperfect in my practice of this because I live in my head a lot. And these are all attempts to get out of my head and to be able to communicate it to people who don't really want the theoretical view of it, but who are reassured by working with someone who does.
And from what you've already described, like it's a really varied work life. And one of the things that we're wanting to do is make this talk of systemic change very practical. So it'd be great if you could just describe what you did last week in very practical ways. So in terms of describing what I did last week, oh, this is really bad because I can't remember what I did last week. Can I describe what I did this week? Because I know what I'm doing tomorrow, so I can remember this week. So in terms of what I did this week, so on Monday I was in the office. I try and be in the office at least twice a week. It's quite difficult not to. I was spending time with the team, setting up for a couple of these big strategic projects and figuring out that making sure that all of the actors in the business really understand what we're trying to do and getting people aligned, sort of normal running the company kind of stuff.
I then hightailed it to Brussels for an evening tweet up because though I focus on local democracy because I think that actually that's where the most interesting stuff happens, it's really important that you've got a bigger scope on this. So I spent the evening at a tweet up in Brussels, and I actually met Captain Europe, who is a man in a superhero suit with a European flag as a cloak, and loads of other really interesting people. But I think that's part of the system as well. I spent Tuesday in Brussels, various meetings, talking to sort of politicians and also to a couple of journalists, and generally just talking about actually we're talking a lot about the European elections which are coming up, which is another sort of part of the democratic picture. Tuesday evening, I dragged myself from Brussels to Solihull. And I spent Wednesday and Thursday in Solihull, which is where we're working on this project called the Social Council. So I'm trying to spend a couple of days a month there actually working with a variety of different people. So Wednesday was a briefing meeting with the senior leadership team and helping them figure out this intersection between this change work and their day job. And that was a really productive meeting, actually. And then went from there to the Action Research Group that I chair at Solihull. So the idea is the Action Research Group is that we have various projects which are in scope for the Social Council, and we use that group to manage data collection, make sure that everyone is staying on track with the vision and values, and also to develop those vision and values. And what was really interesting there was we had a really great conversation about how do you articulate what the Social Council is, which is very informative. And we also... I'm a very impatient person, but that meeting was basically there, and I've been holding back deliberately with that group because they need to own it. And it was a lovely moment where actually they're kind of like, they really want to crack on with stuff. So that was great. Wednesday afternoon, I spent writing and emailing and talking to people, dinner with colleagues. Thursday, which is today, in fact, I met the fantastic police commander at Solihull because there's an intersection between, in terms of systems work, is that you can't just work with it, there is one community and the public services just need to get over themselves and work with that community. So we were talking to the fantastic Solihull police team about how they're going to work on the social council and how we're going to have shared spaces around the communities, which is really encouraging. Then a couple of hours spent on the community work with a multidisciplinary team at Solihull. And then trek back to London, conference calls and things like that, not on the train because that was a disaster. Here to see you, and then tomorrow I've got office work in the morning of doing things which you need to do to run a business, and then I'm chairing an open door webcast for Brighton Council. So for Local Democracy Week, I'm chairing a discussion between the 3 group leaders in the Council of Brighton and Hove to talk about local democracy, which will be quite interesting. They're a really good group, and then I will be doing things with shareholders, and then we have drinks at 4 o'clock every Friday. Then I will do the work, which I should have been doing on Friday, sometime after Friday drinks before going home. So I don't know if that's illuminating. So the last thing that I will do in the week is I'll send an email to my team which captures my week, because when you're all over the place, and when I'm building project, so within that whole mix, I sent out 2 proposals around big system change projects, which I try and keep the team. I could try and warn them that these are coming. I spent some time nailing down some research work that we're doing with somebody else, not nailing it down and kind of like make it die, but in terms of actually helping to shape how they're going to use the research as a stimulus to further work. So I'm doing all of those kinds of things, but that's invisible to the people I work with unless I try and capture it. So I try and be transparent myself. So that's this week. Yeah, if only I could remember what I did last week.
Wow. That's amazingly full.
It is quite busy, eh?
And I think another question is how does it feel to do this work? Like what does doing systems change feel like?
That's a really good question. What does doing systems change feel like? Is that So one of the reasons I'm drawn to this is that the way that my mind works is I see the whole system. That's kind of like that's in my brain, and so it kind of so where some people have got quite visual minds, and other people kind of it's more narrative. Actually, I see the structure system, and so often And so for me, it's quite a relief to be able to work in a situation which is where you can actually see the whole landscape. You're not sat there just with a little bit of a light onto it and you're just looking at one piece, because for me, the idea that you're not working in a system is a bit crazy. The difficulty is, though, particularly when you're trying to do systems change, is that by having that whole systems awareness, you're aware of the fragility of the whole thing, both in terms of the fragility of the system that's there right now, but also the fact that the change that you're trying to affect is always going to be very, very delicate until it's bedded down into social norms and behaviours, because systems aren't about structures, they are about people and how are people interacting. And so there's a constant anxiety, which is that every single bit of this thing matters, and that you need to keep everything in the frame to some extent. And that's both exhilarating and a little bit exhausting. What's a lovely feeling with that, though, is that though the beginning of that kind of like, let's shape the structure of let's describe the structure of this thing can be quite alone, it's quite an isolated kind of thing. As soon as you've got people participant in that, it's really exhilarating, because you suddenly see this thing starting to come to life, and this is what's happening in Solihull, is that actually that it starts providing its own energy, because you have moved people to the point where they're ready to create their new system. So it's I wouldn't work any other way, and I wouldn't work any other way than being multidisciplinary, and I wouldn't be without the tech side of it, because I think technology gives you the greatest opportunity to actually harmonise all those bits of all those people in the system, not in terms of controlling them, but it enables you to shape a shared environment that then can reset social norms. And as long as we do that in a way which is with the grain of social change and the way in which people actually want to behave in their lives, then that's entirely a good thing, I think.
And so in terms of the emotions of the work, you talked about there was a sense of sometimes being overwhelmed by the fragility and enormity of it, and then exhilaration. Yeah. Are there any other emotions?
Yeah. So in terms of the emotions that this kind of work brings out in me, so yeah, as you say, there's the fragility, the sense of the fragility, and the kind of the sense of sort of like exhilaration about it. And then there's a sense of kind of like get over yourself, which is like, it's like, that's kind of like grand architect arrogance. It is that I really genuinely enjoy the surprise that this can bring to you, because you can come up with the most perfect system in the world, but people will always do something really unusual, and they'll surprise you, and they're as likely to surprise you doing something remarkable as doing something which is kind of, sort of unacceptable to you. And actually, it's that kind of not amusement, but I really enjoy the humanity of it. It's just, life is just way too short to spend time with people doing something which they don't want to do. And so part of this is kind of like actually letting people be people, and I really enjoy that. I really enjoy that when you start to scrape away some of the structure and process in councils, you find some really fantastic, unexpected people. And exactly the same happens in communities. And sometimes the best bit about it is like suddenly those new human connections where you've scraped away a load of bureaucracy and suddenly you've connected people who just want to do something really good. It's fun.
That's great. Can you give an example of a kind of systems change project that you work with?
So in terms of an example of a systems change project, the one that I cite most often, and partly because it's most in my head at the moment, is the Social Council at Solihull. So the Social Council is an attempt to describe what does a 21st century public service look like in the context of a network society which has got social values, social behaviours and social technologies. And what we're doing there is we're working in parallel with the community, with the councillors and with the council, as well as with partners, and that's really critical, in order to move forward in parallel towards that as a vision. As I said earlier, holding that vision quite lightly, but always moving towards it and shaping it and building it as we go along. And the medium to long-term plan with that is that we migrate services from the old way of doing things to the new way of doing things, but we don't migrate them until that feels like a safe thing to do. So that's probably my poster child project at the moment, and there's an awful lot going on there, which is down to they have prepared the ground for this kind of change really, really well. I've got a couple of other projects, similar one in East Sussex, which is just about to start, which, because they're a county rather than a unitary, is more structured, and that's quite an interesting change as well. But they've still got the same kind of ambition, which is everything needs to shift, but they need to move in a different way to something which has got the agility of a smaller council like Solihull.
And have you always wanted to make these kind of systemic changes that you're working on now? And what's been your journey to this work? So if you ask, have I always wanted to do this kind of thing? Is that my first degree was in philosophy, which was kind of like great disappointment to my parents because it's not very practical. And the thing with philosophy is all about finding the right question. Because what happens with philosophy is you find the right question and then some other discipline comes along and answers it. But that's kind of remained my mindset. And if you, as I worked through kind of becoming, mesmerised by virtual communities and the way in which, sort of technology can bring people together, and becoming fascinated by democracy and becoming very, very exercised by this issue of, well, everybody is participating in civil society online, but we're not, but democracy isn't listening. Through all of that, is that my mindset is, what's the right question to ask here? And the answer is, you have to do systems change. Yeah, so I just think it's a natural journey, which is that if you want to solve any big complicated problem, actually ultimately you realise that you need systemic change. And it's about what's the place where you're going to stand in order to bring that about. It's kind of related to, I study systems analysis and design, and it's like the big old shock where the engineers and the software developers had this waterfall model, and the waterfall model was always about kind of like, we have a problem, we will design a solution to the problem, we will roll out the solution to the problem, and everything will be fine, the problem will be solved. And that's a way of thinking, and manufacturing thinking, that kind of assumes a fixed context. But there is no fixed context, particularly not if you're dealing with people. And so you have to look at how do you affect the whole system, because any idea you throw into that is constantly being influenced and affected and changed by the system which it's operating within. Which is why software developers online move towards agile and methods of software methodologies, and why we need to make a similar shift in the way in which we try to how we try to change our world. How would I use the stuff that you're doing? I think that the more work that's done around multidisciplinary working, the better, because one of the problems that you have in any complicated project is experts going, well, in my discipline, and other people going, in my discipline. So the more that you can do to actually make it about the system, and lots of people having valuable insights, but keeping the system in the centre of it, I think that really, really helps. And anything that you can do to help influence other practitioners and get them not out of their specialisms, because deep knowledge is really important, but giving them that appreciation about what else goes on. And I think that's how I see systems thinking. So that's one thing. I think another thing is about exploring models for managing these kind of projects. So I have the action research approach, which I use, which I'm turning into a methodology because I'm repeating it in different places and testing it. That is an approach that makes sense and works for me, but I am sure that there are other systems for systems change. And particularly when you're working with any form of government or formal bureaucratic organisation of any kind, is that they will be vested in just-in-time management theory, business process re-engineering, there's a danger we might encounter Prince 2. That all of their project management methodologies are completely non-fit for purpose. So actually, the more that we can capture a process around this stuff, even though that process is actually, we don't know what's going to happen,
the more of that would be the better, really. And I think the last thing would be about, I think if we can bound what we mean by system and take it out of machine speak and make sure that it doesn't, as a result of coming out of machine speak, turn into the whole world. Because there's a real danger that you talk about systems and then people have the mental picture that they have is a technological one, and when you remove the technological picture, they're saying, but isn't this grand theory of everything actually it's the whole world? There's no boundaries, we can't do it. And there's something in between those two things which I think would be really useful to tease out. So what is the system that you're trying to affect? And also perhaps kind of, sort of understanding systems as being porous, that, there are different systems which intersect and interact and overlap, but you can bound a project, you can bound an area of, a sphere of influence.
And how do you do that? How do you boundary systems when...
Well, one of... I bound systems mainly through the fact that I work with local government, because I bound them by place. And so... place as described by people, so none of this kind of like formal kind of sort of bureaucratic boundaries on place, but actually to say, well, look, we are trying to affect the lives of a bunch of people who live in this locality. That's actually a really useful framing, and one which means that you can organise a lot of things around that, and it's very easy to say in and out of scope. So that's a very straightforward way of doing it. We're doing a more challenging systems piece, which is with NHS England at the moment, which is everything which is within scope for NHS England, which is a way more abstract set of boundaries. And at the moment, and this is very early in the work, is that we're actually spending time negotiating the boundaries and discussing what the scope is of that system. So it's definitely a systems project, but we are having to actively negotiate those boundaries, and we're also having to negotiate strategies for what happens when somebody wants into the space who isn't actually in the scope, and coping mechanisms for that. So most of the time it's pretty straightforward, because it's like, I'm going to draw a place on a map. Or actually, I'm going to ask a bunch of people who think they live in West Sussex where they live, and then then I've got my scope. For the other stuff, it's much more about negotiation.
And who are your allies and fellow travellers on the particular systemic change road that you're on?
So the people I'm working most closely on this kind of stuff with would be, firstly, the Democratic Society. So. Which is a not-for-profit, which I'm actually also a governor of, which is interested in how do you sort of democratic reform, but also how do you make community conversations more democratic without making them more bureaucratic, or without emphasising the role of politicians who aren't actually necessarily doing a good representative job. So whole interesting stuff around formal democracy there. We're partnering a lot with Involve, who are a company that they're a not-for-profit as well, who've done a lot. They're really interested in really inclusive participation, and they're basically the offline equivalent of what we do at Public Eye. Because at Public Eye we're much more about digital democracy, and Involve are much more closely aligned with the offline work, and that's why we're complementary. We work quite closely with an organisation called Oxy. Now, Oxy are actually a data company, because in these systems is that it's absolutely essential that there is a shared information piece, that that the data is open, that nobody knows something that other people don't. So actually in this new world, you have to have big data on your side, and they provide that, and they're lovely as well, so it's an absolute joy to work with them. So those would be our main collaborators. And then coming across people like the Point people, someone like Cassie, about to talk about sort of the wider definitions of civic space. To be honest, this is one of the things I would hope to get out of this project that you're doing, because once I raise my head again after the Viva, is that I really want... I think there are a lot of people doing interesting stuff like this, and I'd like to spend more time with them.
And kind of linked to that is about inspiration. So you've spoken a bit about some of the kind of hidden people in organisations who surprise you with amazing stuff. More generally, like, who or what inspires you?
So in terms of who inspires me, I have a very, I am a raging idealist. And so what inspires me is the idea that we've created something amazing with the internet. It really is quite amazing. And I am utterly determined not to let it to become something where we're just selling each other crap. You know, so I mean, I'm motivated by that as an idea. I am inspired by people like Howard Rheingold, Manuel Castells, people who've got a really amazing vision about what this stuff could be. But I'm also, and this is, you know, is I'm really inspired when I see people working, there's so many people working really hard in their communities and who just want to make the place that they live better, that I think that it'd be very easy to disappear off and be kind of like, you know, social media guru type and, you know, sort of spend all of your time with like kind of agencies or kind of like hobnobbing with MPs and stuff like that. But actually, the thing that's really inspirational is that everybody's community could be better if we helped people to bring that about, because isn't it anybody wants to live somewhere which isn't brilliant. And I find it really inspirational when you find these people who don't have this grand stage ambition to kind of like, you know, because I'm terribly competitive and I want to be the queen of everything. I find it really inspirational, these people who just want to make their places better, and I really want to help them.
So I'm at the end of my questions. What haven't I asked you that you think is interesting or important?
I think the question that you haven't asked is about how. I'm also a governor at an academy, so and I'm really troubled by how badly we're educating people to live in this kind of world that we're talking about. And when we talk about, I know, you know, we're talking about systems change, but we're actually talking about a more connected world, a more collaborative world, a world where people will be reliant on their own skills a bit more. So this is part of what's the real question we should ask here, but is actually, are we helping people to be able to be participant in this kind of process? So there's, you know, I come across a lot of people and actually quite a lot of shared belief and shared purpose around the way in which we want to shape the world, but I come across fewer people who are actually worrying about how do we make sure people are able to participate in this stuff. And that point may be biased by the fact that I spend quite a lot of time with community engagement people who I think often kind of like the fact that people are dependent on them to be, you know, I say this with love in my heart, but actually they're not, this idea that they're actually genuinely building people's self-reliance is that who is building people's literacies to participate in this kind of stuff, who is genuinely pushing the point about self-reliance from the point of view of those people, rather than that actually we can't afford to have anything else, so we better make them self-reliant. So there's an underlying question, which is how are we getting people ready to do this kind of stuff, and how do we take it out of the bubble and take it into people's lives?
And who is doing that work at the moment?
Yeah, well, and in terms of who do, I don't see it happening. And so I guess one of the things I'd want to feed into the things that you're thinking about is actually this need to be disseminating this and not educating people in a teachy kind of way, but actually there's a spreading the word. I don't see any way, you know, I think we need an active vision of the future. I think we need to take advantage of this epoch shift to try and shape it to be the kind of world that we want to live in. And I know that sounds really highfalutin and kind of like, oh Lord, look at her. But what else are we going to, you know, if you have the opportunity to do that, that's what you should do. But we're doing that to a lot of people who we're not actually equipping to be part of that conversation. And so you either risk, and this is why I do the network counsellor stuff, is that you need to take the people with you, and that should be something we should have those of us who are working on future shaping kind of things, however successful we're going to be, because like who knows who's going to be successful with this and who's not. We all ought to have a sense of responsibility about how we're helping as many people as possible participate in that shaping.
That's great.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It's really, really fascinating. Okay.
I don't know if any of it works. That's the thing. I mean, that's the thing. So you have that kind of like grand vision of the future, but you're scrabbling around in multiple iterations the whole time. You can't lose the kind of like, actually, if this works, you've got quite a big responsibility at the same time as, but let's be a little bit more humble. Maybe it won't work. You're holding both ideas.
And I think one of the things that we're finding is really interesting is the way that different systems changes work with vision.
Yes.
Because for some people, actually, they think it's really important not to have any kind of vision. Yeah. And that's very much based on the kind of methods that they're using. And so I think it's really, and one of the big questions is how you have a vision, as you articulated, that's light enough to be inclusive, but is clear enough to kind of inspire and galvanise.
And that's exactly the tension. This is what I've been spending the last 2 days fretting about with the team at Solihull. Not fretting, because like it's just more kind of like worrying and poking and thinking about it, is that the issue when you're talking about this in the public service context is they don't have time for everybody to come to a conclusion about what vision we might want to do. We are in a massive hurry. We're in a hurry for 2 reasons. One is the money's running out, and people are getting older, and actually change is bloody urgent at this point. But the other thing is that social change is happening way faster than institutional change. And if we don't want to end up that the future's already been designed commercially, we have to have a plan. So even if it's imperfect, even if it's got to change, you've got to have something, because otherwise you've got no kind of anchor to throw into the future and drag us all there. That's what I think. But it is interesting that lots of people have got quite different perspectives on that.
And I think interesting the amount of ad hocness and pragmatism compared with analysis and strategy, and walking that line as well. Because there's an infinite amount of research and strategizing and mapping that can be done. Yeah. And then there is, what you're talking about, which is really strong imperatives to do stuff quickly, and how that's another line that people are walking on. Yeah, and I describe myself as being hybrid, which is that I am in that theoretical research, hopefully objective reflection space, but I am actually also trying to have an effect, and this is why I've ended up with action research being the way in which I mediate that line. But other people find a different thing with it. But it's disingenuous to say I'm not trying to have an effect. Clearly, I'm trying to have an effect. I've got but I have to just get that vision and values out there in terms of this is what I think. It's your choice, and people either choose to work with me because they share that vision and values, or they don't. And people who don't, they don't tend to want to work with me.